Hello and welcome to Just One More Watch, and welcome to Just One More Mod. This is a long overdue video. I've been sitting on these parts for ages, but haven't quite got around to it. I guess though my confidence is relatively high because of the relative success of the ALIEXPRESS versus Dremel video a couple of weeks ago, so I thought I would give this one a crack. Now, to refresh your memory, I bought a Truly Awful watch by Thomas Earnshaw, who are a Truly Awful watch brand, a number of months ago purely because it had a Ronda R150 automatic movement in it, which is a drop-in replacement for the ETA 2824 and all of its many clones. Now, the reason I wanted the movement was because I bought this little bag of parts from AliExpress containing the case, dial, hands and bracelet of a Titoni Airmaster. Now, I don't know whether it's new old stock or reproduction. I don't really care. It didn't cost a lot and I thought it would be fun to turn that ugly Earnshaw into something hopefully more attractive. Now, I have done this before. You may remember the appalling looking Technomarine that I labelled as the world's ugliest watch. It was a hideous carbuncle, but I bought it because it was cheap and because it had a genuine Valjoux 7750 in it, which I put into this rather unusual new old stock case, which many of you thought wasn't any better looking than the Technomarine. Let's see if today turns into a success or I just turn ugly into a different form of ugly. Let's flip the camera and get on with it. Okay, so we start as we mean to go on today with gloves on because I'm dealing with the internals of watches from the beginning. Look, I do not work in a dust-free environment, so I guess I can only work to a certain standard during these mods, but there's no point making things worse, is there? So this is the little Titoni Airmaster case that I picked up many months ago now from AliExpress. I have no idea whether it's original, whether it's new old stock or whatever. I just don't care. I just bought it because it was a fun little case and it would benefit from a decent movement dropping into the back of it. I'm not sure about the bracelet though. I must say it looks like a rolled link hair nipper. Perhaps I will end up putting this one on a leather strap at the end of the video anyway. And let's remind ourselves of the donor today. Thomas Earnshaw is a shit brand that makes shit watches, including this one. In fairness, it's probably the least shit of their range, but even then, it's not wonderful. The crystal is ugly, and the dial was skewed anti-clockwise. The whole thing feels a bit cumbersome and agricultural. There's no finesse of the case or the bracelet. The crown is enormous. This one dies today. So it's pretty easy to begin with. All we're doing is taking the bracelet off the Earnshaw just to make things easier so I can get it into my little case back vise. Simpler that way. No problems there. Pop it into the case back vise, make sure it's nice and tight, and then unscrew the case back. Now, normally I prefer those simple, cheap, two-prong case back removal tools, but all of mine are broken at the moment, so I'm using this slightly more complex three-pronger. It doesn't take too long, and there is the Ronda R150 settled into a nice big plastic movement holder, of course. That is an enormous plastic movement holder, isn't it? No decoration on the movement, but I don't care. It's got a closed case back on the Titoni anyway. Now, it's not a clone of the ETA 2824, but it is a drop-in replacement. But before I can drop it in, I'm going to have to drop it out. All movements work in a similar way. There's usually a crown stem release button. Push that button in, pull the crown out, get rid of the enormous movement holder, and then drop the dial, hands and movement en masse straight out of the case and onto a movement holding pad. Next up, pulling the hands. Now, you notice the hands are at midnight. It just means that I know when I'm starting and it gives me a better chance of getting the date change in the Titoni bang on when I put the new handset and dial on it. The dials held in place by pins, they weren't too difficult, just get a little wedge in between the movement and the dial, give it a squeeze and off she pops. You can see I'm not being particularly precious with the Earnshaw because I will not be reusing any of these parts. Let's bring in the Titoni case at this point and let's make sure that it is going to be a straight drop-in fit. I might have to slightly manipulate a few of the dial pins to get the movement onto this smaller dial whilst leaving enough pinion exposed for all three hands. Yeah, I just had to bend the pins a little bit just to get them to fit, which they did. And with a little bit of manipulation, everything seems to be going well so far. And once I had the pins aligned, I then screwed them tight using the 2 screws on the back of the movement itself. I then gave the whole thing a bit of a squeeze to make sure enough of the pinion was exposed, and there we are, we're all looking good so far, and the date changes over, so there's no issues with the date wheel being fouled by the dial. Moving on to the handset. It's always a pleasure fitting hands, especially the second hand. You will rarely see someone installing a second hand on camera because it is such a fiddly bastard of a job. Now, the hour hand and minute hand were actually really easy. I couldn't find my Rodico, so I used a 3M sticky tab for hanging paintings, and it actually worked just fine. Hour hand on first, minute hand on second. I now use these handheld hand pressers, just little tweezer type things basically, rather than a machine. I find you get more control and more manipulation that way. Another quick test just to make sure the date does change at midnight, and indeed it does. But I'm sorry, you don't get to see the second hand going on. It was fiddly. I had to do it off camera. I actually had to use a loop while I was doing it off camera. But after 5 minutes and plenty of swearing, it's on. The hands don't foul each other, and the date still changes at midnight when the crown's in the second position, so everything is looking good so far. Alright, the hands are on, let's deal with the case, and let's deal with the tiny crown. It's a very small crown in this Airmaster case, and I've only got one crown stem, so I'm going to have to be very careful when I cut it in a minute or two, but let's just check everything fits first. Pop the movement onto a movement holder, get that old crown out again, and then put the movement, the dial and the hands into its new home, of course after giving it a quick puff with the puffer first. It's another plastic movement holder here, but much smaller than the one in the Earnshaw. Alright, case back on tight, but not super tight because we will be taking it off again once we've organised the crown. And once again, just making sure that when it's cased, everything works as it should. The hands don't foul each other and the date ticks over at 12, and again, changes when the crown is pulled out to the relevant position. Moving on to the crown then, and it's another appearance by my trusty Leatherman multi-tool. I've had this thing for nearly 20 years. I use the Leatherman to grip the crown stem and then manually untwist that big old ugly Earnshaw crown before replacing it with the much smaller Titoni crown. I won't glue it at this stage, but I will use some thread locker a bit later once I've cut it to size. Now you can see when I install the crown and the stem is just a little bit too long. The crown in theory should sit flush or almost flush, but still allow manual winding. You can see here that with the crown installed but with the case back removed, there's just 1.5 mm or so of gap that shouldn't be there. Leatherman to the rescue once more, being very careful not to clip any more than is necessary because I've only got one crown stem, I've only got one shot at sizing it correctly therefore. A bit of thread locker at this point to keep the crown and stem attached to each other long term, and there you go. I got it right, thankfully. I can breathe a sigh of relief. Everything works and the crown sits flush. Onto the bracelet then, but I'll be honest, the more I look at this bracelet, the less I want to look at this bracelet on my wrist. I think it's going to be thin, it's going to be uncomfortable, it's going to be rattly, it's going to take hairs off me, so I'm just going to ditch it and find a leather strap from my box of leather straps instead. And it didn't take me long to find this one, a fine looking leather strap in black by Artisan Straps. Artisan Straps are a Sydney-based company as well, which is an added bonus. Now 19mm lug on the Titoni means I didn't have a massive choice, so I was quite fortunate to find this one. But it's a really nice strap and I think a nice match for the head of the watch. Doesn't take me long to squeeze it in there either. I guess I could have used a 20mm NATO, but I just don't think this watch would suit a NATO strap. The watch may benefit from a bit of colour down the line, but for today, this is a nice choice. And there is the finished article. Now, whether or not you think my efforts have been in vain, I'm sure you will tell me in the comments section. Have I just turned trash into more trash? Honestly though, that Earnshaw was a bit of a disaster, and at least now I have a cute little watch, something you don't see every day, and something I made myself. And that, my friends, is pretty much why I mod watches. In fact, it's pretty much why anybody mods anything. It's for that custom, bespoke, unique factor. It's for the fun of doing it. It's for the fun of creating something that nobody else in the world has. It's in the fun of creating something that's just for you. And I can now wear this little Titoni with pride, knowing that I brought it to life, and I did so by killing a Thomas Earnshaw into the bargain. That is a win-win. Thanks for making it all the way to the back end of this video. If you want to watch some more mod vids on the channel, click here or click here. I'll see you again in the next one.